Placed under the direction of one of the Brain Trust, Rexford Tugwell, the Resettlement Administration provided loans to sharecroppers, tenants, and small farmers. It also established federal camps where migrant workers could find decent housing. The reform legislation of the Second New Deal reflected Roosevelt's belief that the industrial workers and farmers needed to receive more government help than members of the business and privileged classes. The Major Labor Law of 1935 replaced the labor provisions of the National Industrial Recovery Act. After that law was declared unconstitutional, it's called the Wagner Act, and it guaranteed a worker's right to join a union and a union's right to bargain collectively. It also outlawed business practices that were unfair to labor. A new agency, the National Labor Relations Board, was empowered to enforce the law and make sure that workers' rights were protected. The new agency, called the Rural Electrification Administration, provided loans for electrical cooperatives to supply power in rural areas. And a Revenue Act of 1935 significantly increased the tax on the incomes of the wealthy few. It also increased the tax on large gifts from parent to child and on capital gains, or profits from the sale of stocks or other properties. The reform that for generations afterward would affect the lives of nearly all Americans was the passage in 1935 of the Social Security Act. It created a federal insurance program based upon the automatic collection of payments from employees and employers throughout people's working careers. The Social Security Trust Fund would then be used to make monthly payments to retired persons over the age of 65. Also receiving benefits under this new law were workers who lost their jobs. So that's unemployment compensation. People also got Social Security who were blind or otherwise disabled, and dependent children and their mothers. The economy was improving but still weak and unstable in 1936 when the Democrats nominated Roosevelt for a second term. Because of his New Deal programs and active style of personal leadership, the president was now enormously popular among workers and small farmers. Business, however, generally disliked and even hated him because of his regulatory programs and his pro-union measures, such as the Wagner Act. Challenging Roosevelt was the Republican nominee for president, Alfred Landon, or Alf Landon. He was a progressive-minded governor from Kansas. Landon criticized the Democrats for spending too much money, but in general accepted most of the New Deal legislation. Roosevelt swamped Landon, as you can see in the map, winning every state except Maine and Vermont, and more than 60% of the popular vote. Behind their president's New Deal, the Democratic Party could now count on the votes of a new coalition of popular support. Throughout the 1930s and into the 1960s, the Democratic or New Deal coalition would consist of the Solid South, white ethnic groups in the cities, Midwestern farmers, and labor unions and liberals. In addition, new support for the Democrats came from African Americans, mainly in northern cities, who left the Republican Party of Lincoln because of Roosevelt's New Deal. Opinion polls and election results showed that a large majority of Americans supported Roosevelt. Nevertheless, his New Deal programs were extremely controversial and became the target of horrible attacks by liberals, conservatives, and demagogues. Socialists and extreme liberals in the Democratic Party criticized the New Deal, especially the first New Deal of 1933 to 1934, for doing too much for business and too little for the unemployed and for the working poor. They charged that the president failed to address the problems of ethnic minorities. More numerous were those on the right who attacked the New Deal for giving the federal government too much power. These critics charged that relief programs such as the WPA and labor laws such as the Wagner Act, they bordered on socialism or even communism. Business leaders were alarmed by the increased regulations, and also the Second New Deal's pro-union stance and the financing of government programs by means of borrowed money. That's a practice known as deficit financing. Conservative Democrats, including former presidential candidates Alfred Smith and John Davis, joined the leading Republicans in 1934 to form an anti-New Deal organization called the American Liberty League. It avowed its purpose to stop the New Deal from subverting the U.S. economic and political system. Several critics played among the American people's desperate need for immediate solutions to their problems. Using the radio to reach a mass audience, they proposed simplistic schemes for ending what they called evil conspiracies. Dr. Francis Townsend was an example of one of these people who opposed the New Deal. Before the passage of the Social Security Act, Townsend was a retired physician from Long Beach, California, and became an instant hero to millions of senior citizens because he proposed a simple plan for guaranteeing a secure income. He proposed that a 2% federal sales tax could be used to create a special fund from which every retired person over 60 years old would receive $200 a month. By spending their money promptly, Townsend argued recipients would stimulate the economy and soon bring the Depression to an end. The popularity of the Townsend plan persuaded Roosevelt to substitute a more moderate plan of his own, which became the Social Security system. And then from Roosevelt's point of view, the most dangerous of the Depression demagogues was the kingfish from Louisiana, Senator Huey Long. Long was immensely popular in his own state, and he became a prominent national figure by proposing a Share Our Wealth program that promised a minimum annual income of $5,000 for every American family, to be paid for by taxing the wealthy. In 1935, Huey Long challenged Roosevelt's leadership of the Democratic Party by announcing his candidacy for president. Both his candidacy and his populist appeal were abruptly ended when he was killed by an assassin. Of all the challenges to Roosevelt's leadership in his first term in office, the conservative decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court proved the most frustrating. In two cases in 1935, the Supreme Court effectively killed both the NRA for business recovery and the AAA for agricultural recovery by deciding that the laws creating them were unconstitutional. Roosevelt interpreted his landslide election in 1936 as a mandate to end the obstacles posed by the court. President Roosevelt did not have an opportunity to appoint any justices to the Supreme Court during his first term. He hoped to remove the court as an obstacle to the New Deal by proposing a judicial reorganization bill in 1937. It proposed that the president be authorized to appoint to the Supreme Court an additional justice for each current justice who was older than a certain age, 70 and a half years. In effect, the bill would have allowed Roosevelt to add up to 6 more justices to the court, all of them presumably of liberal persuasion. Critics called it a court-packing bill. Republicans and many Democrats were outraged by what they saw as an attempt to tamper with the system of checks and balances. They accused the president of wanting to give himself the powers of a dictator. Roosevelt did not back down, and neither did the congressional opposition. So for the first time in Roosevelt's presidency, a major bill that he proposed went down to decisive defeat by a defiant Congress. Even a majority of Democratic senators refused to support him on the controversial measure. Ironically, while Roosevelt was fighting to pack the court, the justices were already backing off their former resistance to his program. In 1937, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of several major New Deal laws, including the Wagner Labor Act and the Social Security Act. Also, as it happened, several justices retired during Roosevelt's second term, which enabled him to appoint new justices who were even more sympathetic to his reforms. 2 New Deal measures, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 and the Wagner Act of 1935, caused a lasting change in labor management relations by legalizing labor unions. Union membership, which had slumped badly under the hostile policies of the 1920s, shot upward. It went from less than 3 million in the early 1930s to over 10 million by 1941. As unions grew in size, tensions and conflicts between rival unions grew in intensity. The many different unions that made up the AFL were dominated by skilled white male workers and were organized according to crafts. A group of unions within the AFL wanted union membership to be extended to all workers in an industry, regardless of their race and sex, including those who were unskilled. So in 1935, the industrial unions joined together as the Committee of Industrial Organizations, or CIO. Their leader was John Lewis, who was president of the United Mine Workers Union. In 1936, the AFL suspended the CIO, which was renamed the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The CIO broke away from the AFL and became its chief rival. It concentrated on organizing unskilled workers in the automobile, steel, and southern textile industries. Even though collective bargaining was now protected by federal law, many companies still resisted union demands. Strikes were therefore a frequent occurrence in the Depression decade. A final political victory for organized labor in the 1930s also represented the last major reform of the New Deal. In 1938, Congress enacted the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established several regulations on business and interstate commerce: a minimum wage, initially fixed at 40 cents an hour, a maximum standard work week of 40 hours with extra pay, time and a half, for overtime, and child labor restrictions on hiring people 16 years old or under 16 years old. Previously, the Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional a 1916 law prohibiting child labor. However, in 1941, in the case of U.S. versus Darby Lumber Company, the Supreme Court reversed its earlier ruling by upholding the child labor provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act was not only the last but the only major reform of Roosevelt's second term. The New Deal lost momentum in the late 1930s for both economic and political reasons. From 1933 to 1937, Roosevelt's first term, the economy showed signs of gradually pulling out of its nosedive. Banks were stabilizing, business earnings were increasing, and unemployment, though still high at 15%, had declined from the 25% figure in 1933. In the winter of 1937, however, the economy once again had a backward slide and entered into a recessionary period. Government policy was at least partly to blame. The new Social Security tax reduced consumer spending at the same time that Roosevelt was curtailing expenditures for relief in public works. In reducing spending for relief, the president hoped to balance the budget and reduce the national debt. The writings of the British economist John Maynard Keynes taught Roosevelt that he had made a mistake in attempting to balance the budget. According to Keynesian theory, deficit spending was helpful in difficult times because the government needed to spend well above its tax revenues in order to initiate economic growth. Deficit spending would prime the pump to increase investment and create jobs. Roosevelt's economic advisors adopted this theory in 1938 with positive results. As federal spending on public relief works went up, so too did employment and industrial production. Although the economy improved, there was no boom and there was still problems that remained. So after the court-packing fight of 1937, the people in Congress no longer automatically followed FDR, and the 1938 elections brought a reduced Democratic majority in Congress. Millions of people who lived through the Great Depression and hard times of the 1930s never got over it. They developed a depression mentality, an attitude of insecurity and economic concern that would always remain, even in times of prosperity. During the Depression, added pressures were placed on the family as unemployed fathers searched for work, and declining incomes presented severe challenges for mothers in the feeding and clothing of their children. To supplement the family income, more women sought work, and their percentage of the total labor force increased.